Greetings. My name is Carla Dinnold, and I'm the Director of Contracts, Data, and Special Projects at the Fortune Society. I'm also a member of the Policy Center Collective, which is a diverse community of advocates for criminal legal system reform. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bar, a discussion-driven show that examines the legal system from various perspectives, including people most impacted by the criminal legal system. I'm very excited to be with you all here today. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone affected. We ask that you, the viewers, spread word about Both Sides of the Bar and share your comments with us on Twitter at the Fortune Society. Today's show is entitled Incarcerated Women, Disrupted Families, an International Women's Day Special. And we have two very special guest panelists with us today. We have Serena Martin-Liguori, and she is the Executive Director of New Hour. Serena, welcome. I'm so happy to have you.
Great to be
Could
here.
you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm so grateful to be here with you all today, especially as we think about Women's History Month and all of the strides we've made, not just behind bars, but also in reentry. I'm a formerly incarcerated Latina. I'm the executive director of New Hour for Women and Children. And most importantly, I think about raising my voice for the women I left behind. I came home from prison at 22 years old, and there was not a safe space for women to return to our community. And very often, the issues that impact men and women behind bars are framed in terms of men and do not include conversation about women's equity issues, reproductive equity issues, mothers and children. And I can't wait to have the discussion with Andrea, who is a great mentor to me and really, really grateful to be here.
I'm very excited as well. Our next panelist that we have with us today is Andrea James, who is the Executive Director and founder of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. Andrea, again, welcome, and please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me for this conversation. This is something that we talk about all day long, every day. Really excited to have this dialogue with Serena. And again, thank you. We started organizing ourselves as incarcerated women in the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut back in 2010. It was a shift year for what I would say was still mostly criminal justice reform work back in 2010. And Michelle Alexander's book came out, The New Jim Crow. It really lifted and lit a fire under people in the country who really didn't care about the issue of incarceration, particularly the incarceration of women. And we were women sitting in a federal prison, and we, even though there was an uptick in the dialogue around the need to end what they referred to then as mass incarceration, we heard nothing about ourselves. We just did not hear about the separation of us from our children, the horrific conditions that we were living in, the fact that there was no reproductive equity in the space, that we struggled for the barest of minimal health care, and we were absent from voting in our districts and in our states and our communities, and just the real absence of us from our children's lives, from our communities, as mothers, as aunties, as sisters, as wives, as the people who really were the backbone and held our communities together when there became this significant uptick in the incarceration of men in our communities. And so now we became the fastest growing incarceration population. And we decided to organize ourselves to use our voices.
Absolutely. And again, I said this briefly before we started. Just thank you both to the work that you're doing for this population. I actually identify as a child of a formerly incarcerated parent as well. So the impact that this has on children is so drastic and is very rarely discussed. And I thank both of you for your long-term advocacy for this, because I know it's going to help generations to come. So thank you again. I'd like to start off with Andrea. For those who are unfamiliar with the Council's work, can you highlight any specific programs or initiatives that the Council has been doing that you feel have had the most significant impact over the years?
Yeah, well, all of our marching orders come from currently incarcerated women in our membership, and also this vast body of membership that we have around the country that really informs our work. And we had to figure out early, and it took us years to do it. This is long-term work. We're an abolitionist organization, so we believe in ending incarceration of women and girls, stopping the use of jails and prisons for everyone, and creating what different looks like. That was a process that took years to come to because it was a collective people's process. And we did town halls across the country. Of course, our annual conference, the Free Her Conference, we used all of these inroads into figuring out what our work should look like. And we came up with our buckets of work that are all inroads into how do you actually accomplish an audacious goal, such as ending incarceration of women and girls. And so briefly, those are legal and policy, our reimagining communities bucket, and our national Free Her campaign movement. And so I think for me, prisons and jails, although we fight to close a lot of them, and we're in a lot of those fights right now, women's prisons, the real work for us that we're mostly invested in, we're invested in all of it, but is reimagining communities, because nobody's coming to save us. I live in the most incarcerated corridor in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in Roxbury, where I've lived for 5 generations. Nobody's coming up here to save us. And the policies are reverting back to hard on crime. And so I think reimagining communities for us, this very hyper local model of organizing, has been the way that we invest most of our resources.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask a little bit more about the Free Her campaign in a little bit, but I'd like to ask a question to Serena. Serena, can you share some insights into your organization's mission and any specific initiatives that you all have targeted for supporting women and children that are impacted by incarceration?
Absolutely. When I founded New Hour with a small group of volunteers, they had been going into our local jail, the very same jail that I was in on Long Island in solitary when I was, 20 years old. And so it's meaningful to be able to provide 15 programs a week in those jails, the very jail I was in, to support women, bring them home, give them parenting skills, educational opportunities, and reentry support. But most importantly is really speaking to what Andrea said. On Long Island, we have one of the most racially segregated communities in the country. And the disparities here for Black and brown women, Latina women like myself, is egregious. And what we see oftentimes here on Long Island is many of our women come home and live below the poverty line, right here in sort of what people often think of as a very a wealthy neighborhood. And I think part of the work we do is not just the direct service, but it is truly about how do you empower women who have been impacted to then change the system. And we also believe that we must abolish the system, but while there is still a system in place, we need to protect our women behind bars. And one of the things we've just done is introduced a new bill in the New York State Legislature called the CARE Act, the Compassion and Reproductive Equity Act, because what happens to women who are pregnant behind bars, which is, close to 50,000 women every year in the US, 2,000 babies born behind bars. And frankly, what happens to them while they're incarcerated is something that is a complete oversight. And Andrea, I had the honor of hearing her speak about, what happens to women in terms of reproductive equity. We're both Galaxy Gives Fellows, and we were at a conference. And, birthing years, when women go to prison, they lose the opportunity to give birth to their offspring, to their generation, if they're going to be spending their birthing years behind bars. And those are many of my friends. Those are many of the women I left behind. So, we're really passionate about protecting women and also creating systems that end the incarceration of women and girls.
Thank you for that. I mean, that's so important. I'd like to pass this back to Andrea. Again, congratulations on the upcoming 10th anniversary of the Free Her March and Rally. Can you talk a little bit about what inspired the initiation of this annual event and what milestones has it achieved over the past decade?
Yeah, we 10 years ago, I can't believe it, but it's been 10 years since our first March on Washington and rally, and we did the first one in 2014. We were just kind of ramping up to even think about creating, it wasn't rocket science to create a national movement. We were women in the federal system. And so our movement now includes women from every aspect of incarceration, every jurisdiction. But, as women in the federal system, when we started to organize ourselves, we knew as we started to come home that we had to create a platform for that work to continue. But the Free Her rally in 2014, we did under President Obama because he was picking up on this uptick in the country around the need to end mass incarceration. And he started to visit men's federal prisons. And we really didn't hear anything still about us. And so, we decided to do this rally because we had a president who had started the Clemency Project 2014. We actually did the rally right before that. And we say it was because of us, but we're just kidding. But we did encourage him, and he heard us. He heard our call, and he connected us to Valerie Jarrett. And we were invited to the White House a few times. We did an armchair discussion with Valerie Jarrett specifically about women in incarceration, and they centered women in the White House. As a result of that, we worked with Amy Pover from Can Do Clemency, who is the GOAT, the greatest of all times for the fight for clemency for everyone. And Amy really taught us clemency and came into the White House with us. And we moved President Obama and that administration to care about women too. And out of that, 102 women were released under President Obama's Clemency Project. 50 of those were women that we had hands on, including our director of clemency now, Danielle Metz, who had been sentenced to 3 life sentences plus 20 years at the age of 26 under these really old draconian drug war sentences. And she was the last sister we were able to push out. And so Danny leads this clemency work in our organization. Clemency is a huge piece of our work. It's one of the inroads, again, into how we're going to get to ending incarceration of women and girls. So we're coming. It's an election year. It's 10 years later. It's, 2024. Biden was the vice president. We marched on Washington during his first 100 days, a much smaller group, to say, here are the lowest hanging fruit of women who, with a stroke of the pen. But I'll end here by saying our rally and march on April 24th of 2024 in Washington, D.C. is about ending incarceration of women and girls. But it's all of these things that we all talk about, that Serena and her organization fight for. It's about reproductive justice. It's about expanding the feminist lens on this. It's about what Serena just said, understanding that it's not just about our right to choose to have an abortion, but also our right, while incarcerated, to choose to have a family. Lots of sentences preclude a woman from Amy talks about this from her own experience. So, voting rights, the horrific conditions of confinement, the fact that women give up hope. A woman just hung herself in Wasika. We've just lost another woman. Women are being sexually assaulted, raped in women's prisons every single day. How does it affect women who are raped and need to have an abortion now? If you're in Mississippi, that's not happening. So we're coming from California to Boston and everything in between. Every single state is represented this year. It's a much larger event. And we're coming to say, we're not a monolith either. We care about climate. We care about voting rights. We care about homelessness, houselessness. We care about all of these rights. But they intersect, every single one of them, with women in incarceration. And so our issue matters too. And we've got to make sure that we're representing our issue because, quite frankly, except for us and Serena and a whole lot of women now formerly incarcerated leading this push, it wouldn't happen if it weren't for the work that we're doing.
Absolutely. And just to reiterate a point that you made, Andrea, the importance of putting the feminist lens on mass incarceration, because what impacts the women is just vastly different from how it impacts men. Not one is better than the other, but it really does need to be looked at differently. And we need to make advocacy changes based on the population. So thank you both. You both have been speaking about this, that collaboration is crucial in addressing complex issues such as these. I'd like to ask Serena, how does New Hour, more than you spoke about earlier, how do you collaborate with other organizations or stakeholders to maximize the impact and support for families affected by incarceration?
I love this question because there are a few ways that we do this with intention. And one is joining campaigns across New York State, like Release Aging People in Prison, which isn't targeted towards specifically women, but elder people. And we've brought elder women home from incarceration, picked them up at the gates of the very prison I was at myself. And so, Andrea talks about the intersectionality. I will also say that I remember during COVID, I stood in front of Bedford Hills Correctional Facility with Kathy Boudin, who is a dear friend, mentor to me, and a legend. And we stood outside those gates calling for PPE and COVID response for women behind bars. Andrea's right. Oftentimes what happens is women come home and we're the only ones advocating for change behind bars. And, part of what New Hour has done is we've developed a leadership program. We have an Emerge leadership program and a financial wellness program. And that's based on a collective of bringing in speakers from different organizations to tell women, you're not alone. And speaking to those women who most of our women, 3/4 are mothers. So how their children can see them in a position of leadership, in a position of being whole and making positive changes and choices and not being, just victims. We believe in surviving and thriving. And I often say Sharon White Harrigan, dear friend of mine who was in the cell right next to me in Bedford Hills. She's now the ED of the Women's Community Justice Association. I'm a proud board member. And it is really about how we as impacted women go back, reach back in, lift each other up, and work together. So we're working on a bunch of projects and initiatives together. And that, we continue to make sure that there's a network across the US and even beyond for women who come home and need support.
Thank you for that. And, you really just made me think of something. How can women who may not be impacted join this fight? What can both of you suggest as ways for them to learn more about this movement and to join in on the fight?
Well, I think for us, we took a long time to think about that because we really wanted to make sure that women that had the most direct experience were leading and their voices were heard, and there were platforms and infrastructures put in place for that to happen as the experts at the top of the expert pile. But we have a vast volunteer base in all of the states that we're working on initiatives to either close women's prisons or women's jails or to do trainings around reimagining communities. The slate of policy that we work on, including RAP, is one of the leaders and mentors to us as well, who have given us the elder parole and medical parole bills. We have this slate of legislation that we know when passes, decrim drugs, decrim sex work, jail prison construction moratorium, elder medical parole, that sort of thing. So we need constituents. I'll never forget 12 years ago, a legislator looking across the desk from me and saying, my constituents don't care about this. When we were starting the work to pass primary caretakers that has passed in 7 states now and being worked on in 15, which just creates some space, a loophole to not incarcerate a primary caretaker of a minor or of elderly parents and so forth. So that's where constituency is real important. And, these are wider people from wider communities, from wealthier communities who wanted to get involved and engaged in all of our work and Serena's work across the board in the ecosystem and the abolitionist and criminal justice reform ecosystem. And we couldn't figure out how to do that without giving up the leverage for directly affected women having their ideas. So the constituency's job is to support the leadership and the trajectory of the directly affected women. That's how we work. And so they're phenomenal. So our volunteer base, wherever it is in the country, is called People Not Prisons. And so we partner with groups like Surge and other organizations that have, groups in different parts of the country that are not directly affected people for the most part, but they are constituents, and they help us to make it very clear that they don't want new prisons. They expect that money to be shifted and invested in the communities most directly affected by prisons. And so those are the things that's the way that we took us years to get there, but figured out, how do we onboard people who may need to be politicized, who may need to have a little bit of racial equity training, who may need to deal with all of these things that they might not even recognize that they're carrying into the work with them. How do we get them involved and engaged in a powerful way that allows their voices to be heard in the way that we need it to happen?
Absolutely.
And I would just add to that part of that sort of theory and perspective that Andrea, you're sharing is exactly on point with why we tell people who aren't impacted to be upstanders. They can get into a room that we might not be able to get into. And if you are an upstander, you can take that opportunity to talk about this. But interestingly, almost everyone I speak to, from Girl Scouts to DAs to cops, everybody has someone they know who went to prison or jail. So this issue is an issue that does impact everyone if they're willing to be honest and talk about it. And so, I'm always surprised, even talking with folks at Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, even talking with folks who are, maybe on the other side of many of these issues, they'll say, oh, I had a cousin who went to rehab. I had an uncle who went to jail. This issue is a systemic problem across all of the US. And so, we continue to, and sometimes we will kind of put our toe in the door, hold that door open by talking about obviously the children and the impact on families. And we have safe space events. We give out toys during the holidays. There's a lot of ways to do outreach and then pull people into the larger issue to educate them about the systemic oppression of incarceration.
Thank you both, because I think we just really needed to highlight that piece, right? Because I think a lot of times people look at the issue and they say, oh, I don't really have that impact. But to Serena's point, more than not, a lot of Americans do have that impact. They may be 2 or 3 strands off, but it is there, and everyone can get involved to, support this very important mission.
We need them to come on board. Come on to the march. Come to Washington, D.C. We're hoping that New Hour is going to be there. We've got a slot for Serena and her sisterhood to be heard. We've developed a platform for all of these sisters doing this work around the country to come on in, let their voices be heard, send a very clear message. It's not just about President Biden and the federal system. We're sending a very clear message that we've already started rolling out to state governors across this country. Pick up your pen, use clemency, decarcerate. There's 40 states in the country right now that are proposing or currently building new women's prisons or jails. That takes our breath away when we hear that. We're working on a lot of these campaigns to stop this, but we need people. You don't have to be formally incarcerated to come to the rally and to the march. You need to just come. Men, women, children. We've got children who are leading this march. All of the babies that show up are being put in the front to let this president and state governors in the world see that this is an issue we need to take very seriously. We have things in place that we don't have to pass another law or create another piece of policy that we can use to significantly decarcerate on our way to ending the incarceration of women and girls. So everybody's invited.
Thank you so much. So as we close today's session, I do want to just highlight why we're here today. Women's History Month and International Women's Day provide opportunities to reflect on the achievements of women. So I'd like to ask each of you to share your feedback. How do you envision shaping a brighter future for women and children affected by incarceration? And what message would you like to convey to our viewers about their role in this journey?
I am one person who was impacted, harmed by incarceration. And my goal is not to continue to be the leader, but to elevate other leaders and to elevate other people who are directly impacted to take on the leadership in this space. And I often turn to women who come home from our jails and prisons every day and think about, what job opportunities do I have to offer them? How do we make space for more leaders who are directly impacted? Andrea said it before, we need people to listen to those who have been deeply harmed and impacted. That is children, that is, families, that are certainly, those are women who come home from incarceration. They're the key. We have the keys to the answers to make this problem, to change the face of mass incarceration. And I think that we have to continue to be loud. We're seeing, and Andrew talked about a little bit, we're seeing even departments where women have been raped and harmed, and there was a recent expose. The department wouldn't even apologize for the sexual assault and violence that these women had endured while incarcerated in a federal facility. So, I think there's so much to be done.
Yeah, I would just piggyback on that. I mean, as a national organization, we always say this, national organizations, their job is not to go in and drop in anywhere and tell people who are doing local work. My political home is here in Boston, and part of Families for Justice as Healing, which was the actual organization we started in the prison before opening it up to our national platform. And so as a national organization, our job is to create the infrastructure for new systems to be put in place. And so this is the work that we mostly do. And training, as Serena has pointed out, is absolutely imperative for all of us to train. We're not going to be around forever. I'm already tired. So it's about really pouring in to the younger generations of sisters that are going to carry forward this work. And so mostly at the National Council, we're in that period of our existence that is really creating opportunities for more training, more opportunities to share the work, more collaboration. And we're abolitionists, but sometimes that requires that we do non-reformist reform work. Our people are inside of these places. So we really have to find ways, as Serena and New Hour does so well, to work with organizations and agencies such as the district attorneys and things, that as an abolitionist organization, we don't center our work in that, but it's absolutely important that work also is done.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate both of you and your time. To our guests, I thank you for giving us your thoughts and observations about the intersections of women in incarceration. And I thank you, the viewers, for joining us for all of the thought-provoking discussion. In the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we would like to thank you so much for tuning in to Both Sides of the Bar. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Carla Dinnold, and I appreciate you joining us as we critically look at both sides of the bar.